If you've ever wondered how a nation can weaponize paperwork and language and international aid to help disappear children in plain sight, or if you have ever been haunted by the question of what happens to children in the chaos of war, or how they vanish, how they're renamed, and how systems quietly enable their erasure, if so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Until I Find You, Disappeared Children and Coercive Adoptions in Guatemala by Rachel Nolan. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at another one of the Pulitzer Prize finalists. I'm reviewing Until I Find You, Disappeared Children and Coercive Adoptions in Guatemala by Rachel Nolan. I picked up this book because it was a finalist for the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in general nonfiction, so if you're following along with this year's awards, make sure to check out my Pulitzer Prize playlist where I'm covering all the finalists and winners. This book was published by Harvard University Press, and that's part of a larger trend that I've noticed this year. More Pulitzer picks are coming from academic presses than usual. That shift has an impact on both the tone and the depth of some of these works, and I'll be commenting on that throughout this review. Now, I was not familiar with Rachel Nolan's work before picking this up, but I was immediately struck by the gravity of her topic. This isn't just a book about adoption, it's about how governments and aid organizations and even well-meaning individuals became complicit in the erasure of children's identities during Guatemala's long and brutal civil war. It's a deeply researched, deeply researched, as well as an emotionally resonant and at times an infuriating look at how state violence can seep into the most personal corners of life, into homes and families, and even, like I said, the naming of children. Let me give you a quick bio of the author, at least as much as I could find online. Rachel Nolan is a historian and a writer whose work centers on modern Latin America with particular attention to political violence, historical memory, and the intersections of family, childhood, and war. She is currently an assistant professor of international relations at Boston University's Frederick S. Party School of Global Studies. In addition to her faculty role, she was also a fellow at Columbia's University Society of Fellows in Humanities from 2018 to 2019. Nolan earned her undergraduate degree in history and literature from Harvard University and went on to complete her doctorate in Latin American and Caribbean history at New York University in 2018. Her dissertation received both the Dean's Outstanding Dissertation Award and NYU's Humanities Dissertation Prize, marking her early scholarship as exceptional. This is her debut book, and as I've already mentioned, it just came out last year and was published by Harvard University Press. Nolan's research has received support from major academic and philanthropic institutions, including the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Program, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the ACLS Mellon Foundation. She is currently working on a second book about the history of deportations to Latin America, and she contributes regularly to public intellectual spaces like the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. So she's probably an up-and-coming author. So we'll see what comes out next from her. So diving into this book, I like to give a quality summary. Some books are easier than others to give a reasonable summary. This one is one of the ones where it's got, I believe, 10 chapters or so with an introduction and conclusion. So I actually feel capable of giving you a chapter by chapter summary. It's going to be a little in detail, but I also think that that not only tells you what this book is about, obviously, but it gives you a good idea about the arguments that she is making, but I will touch back upon those to give any clarity that I think is necessary. So this book, the introduction, opens by introducing Guatemala's adoption crisis from 1996 to 2007. The country had the highest per capita rate of international adoptions in the world. But behind these numbers lies a very disturbing reality. Many of these children were taken from their homes through coercive means or outright kidnapping. And so the author frames her investigation with two guiding questions. How did this system flourish, and what happened to the children and families caught within it? So in chapter 1, The Lie We Love, this chapter unpacks the mythologies underpinning international adoption, especially the comforting narratives that allow adopters and governments to believe these actions are unambiguously benevolent. Can they be? Sure. But we also have many examples, this book being the case study of that, where there's also a lot of nefarious forces or justifications involved in international adoptions. The author explores how the trope of the rescue is both widespread and, in some cases, can be deeply misleading, and they can obscure the structural violence and the historical inequalities that feed the global demand for adoptable children. In Chapter 2, Social Reports, the author analyzes the bureaucratic infrastructure that made adoption possible. The social workers who were tasked with producing reports that would frame children as orphans that were often based on falsified information. These reports, meant to ensure ethical practices, were routinely manipulated to facilitate the flow of children out of the country. In Chapter 3, Privatizing Adoptions, here the book examines how Guatemala's system shifted from state-regulated adoption to a fully privatized model. This chapter shows how lawyers and private notaries came to dominate the process, creating a profit-driven industry with little to no oversight. The state ceded control, and with it, any semblance of accountability. In Chapter 4, Adoption Rings and Baby Brokers, this chapter traces the network of middlemen, so-called baby brokers, who scouted for children to meet international demand. Sometimes women were coerced into relinquishing their babies, other times children were stolen outright. The chapter details specific case studies and the legal gray zones these actors exploited, and also explores some of the missing records that make it actually hard to fully trace where people came from. Chapter 5, Children for Export, the author broadens her focus to explore Guatemala's place in the global market for adoptable children. She details how adoption agencies, especially in the United States, worked closely with Guatemalan lawyers and brokers, reinforcing the power imbalances between sending and receiving nations. This chapter highlights the racial, economic, and geopolitical dynamics at play. In Chapter 6, Disappeared Children, we see one of the most heartbreaking sections of the book. The author examines how children were forcibly disappeared, not just during the Civil War, but afterwards as well. Even in a peacetime market where disappearance no longer needed to be politically motivated to be profitable, the line between child trafficking and legal adoption were often very blurred, and in many cases outright ignored. In Chapter 7, Best Interests of the Children, the author interrogates the phrase that has long underpinned international adoption, the best interests of the child. She demonstrates how this principle was often used to justify dubious or outright abusive practices, enabling adoptive parents and legal systems to prioritize emotional or cultural desires over the rights of birth families. Chapter 8, Inside Private Adoptions, we have a closer look at how private adoptions operated. This chapter reveals the mechanics of how lawyers handled cases, how fees were structured, and how accountability was systematically avoided. The author walks the reader through the anatomy of a typical case, exposing how little truth or justice was often involved. Chapter 9, The Reckoning, this chapter documents the political and legal fallout. When the corruption of the system could no longer be ignored, Guatemala attempted a reckoning, and the author covers the backlash, as well as a halt in adoptions and the ongoing efforts by some Guatemalan and international institutions to find and return children, or at least provide answers to their birth families. And in the epilogue, The Search, the book closes by returning to the personal. Nolan profiles several mothers and adoptees now working to reunite or find closure. These searches are often emotionally and logistically difficult, as records were falsified or lost. The epilogue underscores how the legacy of coercive adoption continues to shape lives today, long after the official system collapsed. I will say there are several important academic arguments and methodologies that I wanted to touch upon. This is certainly grounded in rigorous interdisciplinary methodology that blends archival research with ethnography and some oral history. Her core argument is that the Guatemalan adoption system, particularly from the 1990s to the early 2000s, functioned not as a humanitarian system of care, but as a privatized, exploitative industry that was shaped by Cold War politics, as well as neoliberal economic reforms and entrenched racial hierarchies. The author situates her work within broader scholarly conversations about political violence, transitional justice, and post-conflict memory in Latin America. She draws particularly on theories of disappearance and coercion, treating adoption as not only a legal or familiar arrangement, but as a site where national and international power structures act upon vulnerable populations, especially in this case, indigenous women and children. Her use of terms like coerced consent challenges simplistic binaries of voluntary versus forced adoptions, offering a more nuanced framework that considers the structural pressures on birth mothers. In terms of methodology, Nolan relies on oral histories and interviews with Guatemalan birth mothers, adoptees, and lawyers, often conducted over many years. These testimonies give voice to people systematically silenced by legal and bureaucratic processes. She relies on judicial and bureaucratic archives, including adoption files, U.S. Embassy documents, and local Guatemalan court records, and she carefully analyzes how paperwork was used as both a tool of erasure and as evidence. She also relies on ethnographic observations and reflections from her own time in Guatemala, adding a layer of lived experience to her scholarly discipline. She also has comparative historical context, especially regarding U.S.-Latin American relations and transnational adoption in other conflict zones such as Korea or Vietnam, which positions Guatemala within a longer global pattern. Her tone throughout is both careful and critical, acknowledging the emotional weight of her material while maintaining analytical clarity. The author addresses the ethical challenges of working with such traumatic material, including how to balance the privacy of participants with the need of public reckoning. Ultimately, her academic contribution is twofold. She illuminates a little understood facet of post-war Guatemalan history, and she offers a sharp critique of how systems of international adoption can obscure violence behind legal and humanitarian facades. I will say that I found this to be an eye-opening book, and at times a deeply unsettling book. As a reader, I found myself repeatedly struck by just how complex, layered, and emotionally charged this topic is. The author doesn't sensationalize the material, but the power of the narrative comes through precisely because of how meticulously she documents the evidence and how thoughtfully she listens to the voices of those affected, especially, as I've said, the indigenous birth mothers and adopted children. Reading this book was not easy. The very nature of the topic, children taken in the wake of a civil war, and the manipulation of legal and emotional frameworks to serve foreign demand, really makes this a harrowing read. What made it even more powerful for me was how the author toggles between zoomed in personal stories and zoomed out analysis of institutions and politics and of broader power systems. The juxtaposition of a single adoption story with diplomatic cables or bureaucratic procedures makes clear how personal grief was entangled with global systems. I was particularly impressed by the author's careful, respectful tone. She does not flatten these stories into neat narratives of victimhood and villainy. Instead, she offers nuance, something that's often missing from broader discussions about not just international adoptions, but about conflicts and the people involved in conflicts, about a lot of international issues. I think that she does a great job at giving a lot more context and a lot more important information to help other people see just how difficult exploring something like this can be. The methodology that she uses, as well as the restraint in her writing and the emotional sensitivity of her approach, all made a strong impression on me. This book also prompted me to think more broadly about the power of stuff like paperwork, how forms, signatures, and stamps, as well as legal fictions, can erase identities and reassign family ties. And so the author shows how systems that appear bureaucratic or even benevolent can facilitate incredible harm when they're not accompanied by transparency or accountability. This is a book that will stay with me. It's not something that I'd recommend lightly, but it is absolutely something I'll be thinking about and referring back to for a long time. I am confident of that. With that said, who is this for? This book is for readers who are interested in the intersections of history, as well as human rights and global politics. I'm sure there are plenty of other works out there similar to this that I could compare it to, but at the moment I am blanking. I remember in my history of Latin America reading stuff related to this. I've also read books, heard podcasts, and seen stories about similar issues, particularly with adoption in countries like Spain and Portugal. And I know there's a lot more out there that I could explore. I'll just say that the approach to this one, especially just the quality of the historic methodology and her tone, all of it made this a very powerful approach. And so if you have any familiarity or any interest in any of those other elements of forced or coerced adoption, I think that this would be a good reference point or a good starting point for anyone that would like to have a look at it. I would say that this would be especially appealing to historians and scholars of Latin America, especially over adoption or childhood or political violence. I think that this could probably be appealing to any policymakers and NGO workers that are involved in international adoption or migration, or any students or educators that are looking for a nuanced, well-researched case study on post-war Guatemala and its legacies. Also, for general nonfiction readers who gravitate towards investigative narratives that bring together personal stories and structural critique, I really think you would enjoy this as well. Or just anyone concerned with how systems of power manipulate the most vulnerable, especially during and after major conflicts. It's also for people who are willing to sit with discomfort. and are willing to reflect on global complicity and think hard about the ethics of care and family and nationhood. So who is this not for? Well, it's not a casual read, and it's not for readers seeking an uplifting or a redemptive narrative. While there is some hope in some of the stories, I would say largely it's just about the systemic harm, the erasure, and the long shadows of conflict and war. And so this may not be for you if you prefer books with a clear-cut villain and heroes. I would actually say that Nolan's account is somewhat complex. There are some individuals that you might come away with saying, I don't like that person. But there are also going to be individuals that you come away with thinking, well, I think they had a somewhat noble beginning. It's just with time, things became more and more complicated. Or if you're looking for a personal memoir or a single narrative arc, this again is not, the scholarly work that you want to be looking into. You're much better off looking at something else. Or there is an academic tone to this, although it is not overbearing academic tone, but that could be something that also pushes some people away, especially when looking at something just so emotionally raw. There's elements of that academic tone that may just feel difficult to engage with. And then again, I don't blame anyone that just doesn't have any interest in engaging with the violence of colonialism or racism or systemic corruption. That's not something that everyone always wants to engage with. All of us at some point in our life should be willing to ask more questions about that, but I can see why that may not be something that at any given moment you may not want to be reading about, or maybe you've just read enough of that already. I can understand all of those reasons. Because if you're expecting a heartwarming story about adoption, this certainly is not that. This is much more of a critique. It is a powerful book if you're willing to engage with it on its terms. It is an unflinching investigation into how all sorts of powerful things like war, bureaucracy, and inequality intersected to create one of the most troubling adoption systems in recent history. The author has written a book that is not only academically rigorous, but it is emotionally resonant, bringing voice to those who have often been silenced or obscured by paperwork or politics or just mere distance. If you're following my 2025 Pulitzer Prize playlist, you'll know this book was a finalist in the history category, and it's easy to see why. It tackles urgent questions about memory and justice and identity, and questions that matter far beyond Guatemala. This is not a comfortable read, but I think for many people, it is a necessary read. Of course, I would love to get this conversation going. Please let me know what your thoughts are on this book in particular, or any of the other Pulitzer Prize finalists, or any other book that deals with this topic. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, if you're enjoying this video or any of my videos, please share them with a friend, with family. The more people that know about my videos in this channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.